Hi, everyone. Welcome to the Crossings online service. And I want to tell you how glad I am that you're jumping in with us, especially today, because today we are kicking off a series that I believe has the potential to be one of the most important series of messages that you will ever hear at a church. And I'm going to tell you why in just a few moments. But today I want to let you know that this particular message, I believe, could be actually one of the easiest for you to ignore. Now, today we are kicking off our relationship series because here's what I know. I know we all want our relationships to get better. I mean, as a pastor, I do a lot of weddings. And my favorite moment at every wedding is always when the couple does the vows. When two people stand before each other and they promise for better or worse, or richer or poorer, in sickness and health, till death do us part. I mean, every wedding, it's such a beautiful, emotional moment because these couples, they share their hopes and dreams for each other and for their future. And I'll tell you, as a pastor, I also meet with couples who they're also going through tough times. And I'll tell you, I've never sat down with a couple and this has been their problem. This is what they've said to me. I've never had a couple say, Andrew, we needed to meet with you today because our problem is our marriage is going too well. My spouse is too loving. My spouse is too sacrificial. My spouse looks too much like Jesus. I've never sat in that meeting because here's what I know is like that no one sits for that meeting. Now, here's what often happens. Often what happens is couples, they start out and their relationships look like this. But over time, they end up looking like this. And I bet all of you watching, you have heard the number of the divorce statistics that 50% of relationships end in divorce. And while I know that number gets debated and talked about, what I can tell you is that most researchers, they put the number of divorces somewhere between 30 and 50%. I mean, you think about that. 30 to 50% of marriages are going to end in divorce. And there's a whole another lot of marriages that they're just hanging on by a thread. Or there's a bunch of marriages I know today where both partners have just silently agreed, we're going to hang together until the kids are out of the house. You see, no one dreams about a marriage like this. No one dreams of a cold, loveless relationship. So today, we are kicking off a relationship series, and we're calling it Green Flags, because we are going to be looking at the skills and traits of a great relationship. There is this great verse from 1 Peter. Here's what it says. It says, above all, love each other deeply, because love covers over a multitude of sins. I mean, imagine with me if the defining characteristic of your relationships was that word love. And today, we're not just going to talk about marriages, although, of course, we will talk about marriage. Today, we're going to talk about all of our relationships, because all of us want our relationships to get better, to get healthier. So if you want stronger friendships, if you want better romantic relationships, if you want to even have better work relationships, even if you want to improve your relationship with your in-laws, I want you to know that this series is designed for you. So here is where we're going over the next few weeks. Next week, we're going to be talking about how do we listen well. Then we're going to look at the blind spots that we have and unpack how do we actually get to know ourselves. And then on March 9th, we're going to have our founding pastor, Tim, and his wife, Sue. They're going to talk about fighting fair. And then we're going to wrap up our series talking about trust. So I want to encourage you today to make a commitment to be here each week. Maybe you need to subscribe to our YouTube channel, or maybe you need to show up on our campus if you live nearby, because this series is going to be for you. Now today, we want to talk about communication. And I'll tell you, here's what makes this topic tricky. Around 80% of people believe they are good communicators, that they are able to see and articulate problems and roadblocks and challenges in relationships. 80% of people, that means 4 out of every 5, say, I'm a pretty good communicator. And yet, can you guess what issue couples identify as their biggest challenge in a relationship? Yeah, communication. Here's what that means. Most couples involve two people who say, you know what, me personally, I'm a good communicator. I am clear. I'm able to focus on the problem. But our issue is communication, which is a nice way of saying that I'm good at communication, but you, not so good. So today we're going to spend a few minutes and we're going to talk about how did two people who both believe they are good at communicating claim that communication is their biggest issue. So today, if you've ever had a conversation and it didn't go well, if you've ever felt missed in a conflict with someone you love, if you've ever had a conversation with someone and walked out feeling worse than better today, I want to help you. Today we are going to talk about the expectations we carry around in relationships. You see, communication rarely breaks down because of what we say. Where communication breaks down is because we carry into our relationships these expectations that we never share. I mean, let's just look at marriages. Each person walks into a marriage with a certain list of expectation. I mean, here's just a few. Each person walks into a marriage with the assumption or expectations around money. Do we have a budget? Or as a couple, are we just going to spend and hope it all works out at the end of the month? Each person in a marriage has expectations around household responsibilities. Who does what around the house? We have expectations around work. Will both spouses work? Will one work part-time or one stay at home? We have expectations around conflict. Some people think, if we're in love, we should never fight. Other people think fighting is a natural part of marriages. What's our relationship with our in-laws is going to be another expectation. Can our in-laws just pop in, or do they need to schedule a visit? We have expectations around kids. Are we going to have kids? Do we want kids? Are we going to adopt? How about sex? There's so many expectations when it comes to sex. How often are we going to have sex? Do we talk about sex or take hobbies? Each couple has an expectation with hobbies. Is it okay to have different hobbies? How much money are we going to spend on hobbies? And then, of course, you have faith. Are we going to be a couple that goes to church a couple of times a year? Or are we going to go every week? Is it important for us to have our kids in church? All of us carry these expectations for so many areas. And I'll tell you, in our minds, our expectations, they're normal and realistic. But then we end up in a relationship with someone whose expectations are different. And what happens is our communication breaks down because we have an expectation gap. Now, this doesn't, of course, just happen in marriages, but it happens in every relationship. I mean, maybe you've had this experience even in the past year. Maybe for you, it happened with your parents this past Christmas. Maybe you've been in a serious relationship for a few years now, and this past year you decided to spend Christmas Day with your significant other and their family. So you call your mom and dad, and you think, it's no big deal. We'll celebrate Christmas in January. But the moment you tell them, I'm not going to be around this Christmas morning, the phone goes silent. And you can just sense they're so upset. And the last couple of months, maybe your parents have made all of these passive-aggressive comments about how it seems like you don't really care about spending time with them. What happened there? You communicated clearly, you were kind, but turns out there was an expectation your parents had for you, that you would spend every holiday with them. You see, that's the expectation gap. Or maybe right now you got a roommate that is just driving you crazy. I mean, they never clean up after themselves. And so you find yourself, you're losing your mind because you just have this expectation that if you use a dish, you should clean a dish. If you make a cup of coffee, you should clean up after yourself. You see, so many of the challenges we face in life, they are because of this expectation gap. One of the first people I ever had a chance to hire, I was working at a church. This was probably about 20 years ago now. But I hired this guy at the church I was working at the time. And he was a good guy. He loved Jesus. He was super gifted. And so I thought to myself, I'm like, this guy is going to be a perfect fit for this role. But here was the problem. You see, this guy, he loved Jesus, yes. But he was terrible at calling people back or returning emails. And so what happened all the time is I would swing by this guy's desk and he would just be getting back from this marathon prayer meeting, which was super cool that he did this. But I would ask him, I'd be like, hey man, have you called back so-and-so? And he'd be like, not yet. But I did just get done praying for her. And I would just get so mad at this guy because I would think, dude, how can you not call someone back? Now what happened? I had this expectation that, when someone calls you, you're going to return their call within 24 hours. You see, the biggest challenges we face in most communication challenges with people, in most conflicts, is around expectations. You expect your parents to be okay with you occasionally spending holidays with in-laws. But they expect, because they raised you, because they spent hundreds of thousands of dollars feeding and housing you, because they put up with you during your teenage years, they expect you to spend Christmas morning with them. Or you expect your roommate to pick up after themselves immediately and not be a slob, but they expect you to have some grace with them leaving a few things out until later and they can get around cleaning up. You see, when we find ourselves in these moments, here's what most people do to navigate the expectation gap. The first strategy most people use is to convince the other person why my expectation is the right expectation. Let me give you an example from my own life. I have 2 kids, and it seems to me that my kids always get sick on my busiest days. And so here's what will happen in our house. One of my kids will wake up and they're obviously sick, like to the point where there's no way they can go to school. So my wife and I, we will have to come up with a plan. And my wife and I, we both work full time. We both have very demanding jobs. So we'll have like this 10-minute window where we got to figure out a plan for who's going to stay home with our sick child. And so here's what happens inside of my brain. Okay, and I'm not proud of this, but here's just what happens. Okay, I know how busy my day is. I have meetings, I got people who are counting on me, I got a message to write. So I have this expectation, I carry it into this conversation, that my wife should have to figure this out. My expectation is I'm so busy I can't help. So I go into this conversation and I try to convince my wife I can't help. And so I start the conversation by saying something dumb like, "Oh, I'm so sorry. There's no way I can stay home today. My day is crazy. I have too much going on. Besides, I think I stayed home with them last time." Now, what am I doing here? I'm trying to convince my wife that my expectation is the right expectation. Anyone want to guess how that conversation goes when I try to convince her? Not good. Because usually whenever there is a communication breakdown, our default strategy is I got to convince the other person to see things my way. I got to lay out to them why I am correct, why my feelings, why my opinions are the most important. And what I hope, in essence, is that they cave. You see, that's our first strategy. Our second strategy that some of us use is guilt. And I bet you know someone in your life who is a master of using guilt. I mean, they are able to pout and make you feel bad the moment things don't go their way. I mean, kids are, of course, masters of this. They give us those pouty eyes. They stomp their feet. They whine. They complain to get their way. And that's fine, of course, for kids. But the truth is, some of us have never really grown up from this. And so what we do is we try to guilt the other person into giving in to us. Some of us have become masters of pouting or saying things like, no, everything's fine. But, of course, everything's not fine. You see, what happens in most relationships is we reach this moment of conflict, this moment where communications break down, where we hit this expectation gap. So what do? We try to convince or we try to guilt the person into giving in to us. But here's what happens over time. That exact same person who we're trying to convince or guilt, over time what happens is we move towards bitterness. We get stuck in these moments of conflict where the expectations we have, they don't line up, and we try to convince the other person and guilt the other person, and they try to do the same thing to us. And so what happens over time is we get bitter. And I bet you've seen this in couples over time, haven't you? I'll tell you, one of the most painful things in life is to watch a couple who is obviously bitter towards one another. They're constantly sniping at each other, constantly rolling their eyes at the other person, constantly making those little comments that tear the other person down. You know, there's this fascinating verse in the book of Hebrews, chapter 12. Here's what it says. It says, "Watch out that no poisonous root of bitterness grows up to trouble you, corrupting many." The idea here is that over time in relationships, when communication breaks down, when we spend our time trying to convince someone to get our way, that we're right and they're wrong, what happens is for both parties, bitterness sneaks in. It's like a little root that just begins to grow up out of the ground. It's hardly noticeable at first, but over time it starts to destroy our relationships. So what do? How do we break this cycle? Well, I'll tell you, first, we need to explore and express our expectations. And so for the next few minutes before we're done, I want to spend just a few of those moments and I want to talk about how do we do that. And I want to give credit where credit is due. There is a pastor and writer I am deeply indebted to. His name is Pete Scazzero, and he's done a great work talking through expectations. So specifically what I want to do is I want to leverage some of his work, and I want to talk about, for us, how do we explore and express our expectations? So Scazzero talks about 3 different expectations that we carry. I want to encourage you to write these down. The first is unconscious expectations. You see, a lot of times we carry expectations that we aren't even aware of. I have some friends who, when it comes to their birthday, they expect you to make a big deal out of it. Now, if you were to ask them, hey, is your birthday important to be celebrated? Do you care a lot about that? They would be like, no, not at all. But I'll tell you, if you forget their birthday, if you don't celebrate their birthday appropriately, they get really hurt. Now, they aren't doing this on purpose. It's just for them. It's an unconscious expectation. And I'll tell you, we all have these. We all have things that are important to us that we don't even realize, things that we don't even expect. There's this great prayer in Psalm 139 where the author, King David, says this. He says, search me, God, and know my heart. You see, it's our responsibility to uncover our expectations. You see, we pray, we ask God to help, and then we have to become curious about our feelings. And I want to pause here because I'll tell you, this is an area where I feel like I have a lot of room for growth. I'm not a big feelings person. Honestly, usually my default when I'm sad or upset, when I'm feeling a lot of feelings, is I try to mentally gaslight myself. Like if my feelings get hurt, I'll usually tell myself things like, Andrew, stop whining about that little thing. Don't you know how many people have it worse? Or if I find myself experiencing anger towards someone, this thought just pops into my head. I'm like, Andrew, why are you still angry at that person? Why can't you forgive that person for what they did? I mean, Jesus has forgiven you, Andrew. You see, my default is to talk myself out of certain feelings. But I'll tell you what I'm learning now is to be more curious, to ask myself the question, why am I upset? Why am I angry? And what I will often find at the core is that there is this unconscious expectation I was carrying into this relationship. So what you and I are going to do is we are going to uncover our unconscious expectations. Now, the second kind of expectation that Scazzero talks about is that we get stuck in relationships are unspoken expectations. Okay, another confession from me for a moment. Sometimes I will send someone a text that says something like, no rush on this, but when you get a chance, can you give me a call? Now, what I'm doing here is I will communicate one thing, but inside my expectation is give me a call right away. You see, often our unspoken expectations, they will become clear to us when we have thoughts that begin with everyone knows and then just fill in the blank. When we think to ourselves things like everyone knows the guy in the relationship takes out the trash and the wife cooks, or everyone knows that my job is so demanding so it takes priority over yours, or everyone knows you drop everything when your kid needs help with their homework. You see, these are unspoken expectations. There's this great verse from Ephesians chapter 4. It says, do not let any unwholesome talk come out of your mouths. The idea here is, of course, don't say anything that's false, but also don't say anything that's not fully, wholly the truth. Let me give you an example of this. If your spouse says to you, are you okay if I go out with some friends who are in town next week? And you say, of course. But you secretly want them to be back in time to help with the bedtime routine for your kids, and you get resentful when they aren't, that right there is an unspoken expectation. If you're a boss and you tell an employee, get that project to me anytime next week, but then you get mad at them because they didn't respond to the end of Friday, whose fault is that? It's yours, because that was an unspoken expectation. So what do? We become aware of our unspoken expectations, and then we begin to talk about them. We say things like, sure, you can go out, but is there any chance you could be back by 8:30 to help with bedtime? Or we send an email and we say, hey, I really need this project by next Friday, but is it possible that you could get it to me Wednesday afternoon so I can review it? You see, we start speaking our expectations. And then finally, what we find from Scazzero is we all carry around unrealistic expectations. You see, what happens is we begin to uncover and speak about our expectations. What we find is, man, I got some expectations that felt realistic to me, but are in fact unrealistic. So I'm going to overgeneralize here for a moment, so just hang with me. But guys, if you have an expectation that your wife will do all of the cooking, all of the cleaning, all of the laundry, because that's what your mom did for you, that right there is an unrealistic expectation. Ladies, if you expect your guy to be able to read your mind because you've watched 100 Hallmark movies and that's what you just see in it, that is an unrealistic expectation. You see, these are, of course, generalities, and obviously they're not true of everyone, but what is true is you and I, we carry some unrealistic expectation. Now, of course, not every expectation is unrealistic, But the only way to find out is to explore and express them to the people around us, to figure out what is underneath the surface in our lives. What we need to do is we need to explore and express our expectations, and what we're going to find is our communication, it actually improves. We begin to experience a greater connection to people. Let me read this verse from 1 Peter again. It says, above all, love each other deeply, because love covers over a multitude of sins. This right here is what we were made for. We all desire to experience deep, authentic relationships. We all want to experience relationships of grace and goodness. And it's never going to happen until we uncover and we start discussing our expectations. And so today, in a moment, I want to pray for you in your relationships. But before we do, I just want to let you know that no one models healthy relationships like Jesus. And when you study his life, what you see is that Jesus is the one who loves perfectly. And so let's pray together. And so, God, we come before you and we thank you. Because, God, you are so good and so gracious. And so this week, just help us to uncover just some of the expectations we've been holding on to. God, if there are things that we've been holding on to that we need to speak to another person, some expectations we've been carrying, help us. And God, help us to just navigate our relationships so they become healthier and healthier. And just bring honor to you. We love you, God. And we pray this in your son's name. Amen.